This interview is part of the History Heard project. The content of this interview may be used for historical research. However, no part of the video itself may be reproduced without the express written permission of an authorized representative of History Heard. Today is June 24th, 2009 at 11 a.m. This is an interview with Len Downie in Washington, D.C. He was born on May 1st, 1942 in Cleveland, Ohio. Before you were the executive editor, you were the deputy editor of the Metro section?
I started the Washington Post in 1964 as a summer intern reporter. I was an investigative reporter for a long time in my 20s. And then I was away on a fellowship for a while, and I came back as the deputy metropolitan editor of the paper. And I came back from my fellowship in July of 1972, just a couple weeks after the Watergate break-in. And so I helped run and the Watergate story was being covered by local reporters because it was a local burglary.
Right.
And Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were on the local staff. And so I first began supervising a lot of the rest of the local coverage because the Metropolitan editor, Harry Rosenfeld, and the city editor, Barry Sussman, were very much caught up in the Watergate story. But then I became part of the group of editors who vetted all the Watergate stories, and then as time went on, and the Senate began its Senate Watergate hearings investigating Watergate, I edited all those stories because there was too much for one editor to do. And then after that, I took over editing Bob and Carl until Richard Nixon resigned.
Mm-hmm. So what did it feel like to be part of such a huge story?
Well, it's interesting because I know the movie made it seem glamorous. Actually, the movie didn't make it seem glamorous. The movie was a very accurate movie, and if you look at if you watch the movie, you'll see that the work involved wasn't glamorous. It was very difficult work, and it was scary work because we were dealing with the highest levels of the United States government. We were under a lot of pressure. Mrs. Graham was under a lot of pressure because at the beginning, most people, including other journalists, didn't believe this story. And all of her very important friends in Washington were telling her, watch out, you're making a big mistake here. The paper, the Washington Post company had just gone public, which means it was selling stock in itself. And so you had that worry, what was this going to do to the stock? And Richard Nixon had a friend of his challenged the Washington Post television licenses, which were very important to the health of the company. So everything was on the line, and we could feel that all the time, actually. So actually it was a very nervous time, and we were working around the clock. So it was very important work. You could feel how important it was, I guess maybe exhilarating in that sense. But only in retrospect did it seem to be a big deal and glamorous.
And we recently found out the New York Times had a tip about Watergate also, but they just didn't. They thought the story wasn't worth running.
Well, now you're worth running. I mean, they didn't even check out their tip, and just having a tip is not. I mean, we all get tips about all sorts of things all the time, and by the time that happened, we had been doing a lot of basic reporting that had built up a certain level of knowledge on our part that would have been hard for them to match. So I don't take that as a very serious thing.
Did you ever consider getting rid of the story, thinking that it was not
No. We understood from the start that something was wrong here. The question was what was wrong, and ultimately who was responsible. How high up did the responsibility go? And by the way, I should say about the New York Times that eventually a reporter named Seymour Hersh, Cy Hersh, a very famous reporter, who had done the My Lai stories during the Vietnam War, and had joined the New York Times later. Started working on this story, some months after Bob and Carl started. And that was the first competition we had. And Cy understood what the story was about. He knew Bob and Carl and me. So he became serious competition. And that was good. That was very good, I think, because then we began competing with each other for breakthroughs on the story. And it made people take the story more seriously than they might have otherwise. And then Walter Cronkite, on the CBS Evening News, one night decided this was an important story that television wasn't covering and still most American journalism wasn't covering, and he put front pages of the Washington Post Watergate story up on the screen and spent about 10 minutes talking about the story in a half-hour newscast, which was unheard of at the time. And that really was a sea change also in public acceptance of the journalism we were doing.
Wow. And before Mark Felt revealed his identity, people must have asked you about it all the time.
Yes.
And did you ever, if you were one of the people who knew about it,
I didn't know about it for a long time. Only Ben knew for a long time, and Bob and Carl, of course. And so, like all during the reporting of Watergate, I didn't know who Deep Throat was. I did know, however, who all of Bob and Carl's other sources were, because we had to know that. Only Deep Throat was the only source that they were allowed to keep completely secret like that. And we never published anything that Deep Throat said by itself. We would use him for leads to do further reporting or to check on whether our reporting was heading in the right direction, as you, again, can see in the movie or read in the book. But all the others, we had to know who their identities were, where we got the substantive information from. So, and they had sources throughout the re-election committee, throughout the White House, throughout the rest of government, including the investigative agencies. So I knew all the people who weren't Deep Throat. That was a unique position I was in. Over the years, I tried to guess who he was.
Yeah.
And I would come up with a guess to Bob, and of course Bob wouldn't react because he had promised Deep Throat he wouldn't tell anybody until he died. So I made two mistakes. I first tried Elliot Richardson, who had been the one attorney general who quit in the Saturday Night Massacre, and he eventually died, and it wasn't Elliot Richardson. So then I guessed Al Patrick Gray, who had briefly been the FBI director during that period, was forced out by Nixon. I thought maybe that was a logical choice. And I knew that in both the case of both Richardson and Gray, they were not sources whose names I knew, so they could be Deep Throat. And unfortunately, he died, and it wasn't him. So I figured I've already had 2 strikes. 3 strikes is enough, and then I'm out. So I really thought hard about this now. And I remembered that back when I was an investigative reporter, I dealt briefly with Mark Felt myself when he was number 3 in the FBI. And I'd found him to be, at a time when the leadership of the FBI was not very impressive, I found him to be impressive and a straight shooter and a person who cared about things. And I remembered that he was not one of the FBI sources whose names I knew. So I wondered if it might be him. And there were a variety of other reasons why I thought it might be Mark Felt. And so I wrote his name down on a piece of paper, put it in an envelope, gave it to Bob, said, "This is my last guess. This is it. If I'm wrong now, I'm out." And he, of course, took it and never reacted.
Yeah.
And then there came a time when Bob would frequently, and still does, lecture on college campuses. And he was always being asked about Deep Throat, and he would always say, "I can't tell you talk about him until he dies. That's my agreement." But then he started to say, "Well, he's very ill. We don't know how long it might be. Perhaps pretty soon you'll know who Deep Throat's going to be." And I called Bob into my office and I said, "Hey, wait a minute. If he's going to die soon, we need to be prepared. It's going to be a huge story." And Bob sat there sheepishly. I couldn't quite figure out why he wasn't reacting to what I was saying at first. And he said, "Well, I've never told you this, but I've written a book about my relationship with him." I said, "I need to read that book right now, and we need to decide what we're going to do." And so he had me over to his house in Georgetown, and we sat down and ate breakfast, and he brought out the manuscript, and I opened it up, and it was Mark Felt.
So you guessed it right.
So I guess finally I guessed it right. It wasn't a great accomplishment.
And so during the Watergate scandal, the Watergate story, the Washington Post came under a lot of pressure from some Republican Party members who later wound up in jail. And did any of them ever write to you or send you anything apologizing?
No, nor to anybody else.
Right.